I'm Jana.
And I'm Carol.
And this is the Real Talk Recreation Therapy Podcast.
On this podcast, we talk about real experiences and real research that back up the use of recreation therapy as a method of treatment for a variety of populations.
We try to keep it real as we address concerns and successes that we and other recreation therapists have had as we all navigate this awesome career field.
We don't have it all figured out, but one thing we know for sure is everything gets a lot easier when you can talk it out with a friend.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We're super excited today to talk to Keith Barney about his experience with adaptive sports. Keith Barney has used a wheelchair since he experienced a spinal cord injury in 1974, which was due to a hunting accident. After completing a mission in Tampa, Florida, he attended BYU where he met his wife, Trish. Together, they went to Portland, Oregon, where Keith completed a master's degree in social work. After graduation, the family moved back to Utah, where Keith worked in a spinal cord injury unit, helping people with the new injuries learn how to live with a disability. Along the way, they have raised 3 children and enjoyed all kinds of family adventures and vacations that included camping, fishing, and horse competitions. After competing in many sports, Keith was named a member of the United States Paralympic team that competed in Salt Lake City in 2002. He recently completed a PhD in recreation with a certificate in disability studies at the University of Utah and is an assistant professor at Brigham Young University. He is currently serving on the advisory board for LDS Humanitarian Wheelchair Project through LDS Charities. He has visited Kenya, Malawi, Nepal, and Mongolia on trips to help improve the lives of people who live with disabilities. And he is now a proud grandfather. Welcome, Keith. We're so excited to have you on our podcast.
Thank you.
I know Keith Barney from school. I went to BYU, Idaho, and he was my professor one of my professors in recreation therapy. And we're super excited to talk to you about all of your experiences and share with recreation therapists and their clients how people can get involved in adaptive sports. Carol and I have a lot of experience helping people who are in the military getting into adaptive sports, but we're super excited to talk to someone who doesn't have the military as that support to get into the sports, how you found the sports and all of that. So thank you so much for coming with us.
You bet.
First, let's just have you share your story, kind of get everyone up to speed on your experiences in adaptive sports and all of that.
Okay. Well, in 1974, there were not that many sports programs around. And I especially, lived in rural Idaho. Idaho Falls was my hometown. And so I was not introduced to any wheelchair sports during my rehabilitation at the University of Utah in 1974. And then I went home to a rural area and I never really got a chance to do anything. So all of the stuff I learned about with my wheelchair was all about going outdoors to go fishing and camping. So I ended up putting big fat black beach cruiser tires on my chair. And I was thinking outdoors and how to get better access there. But along the way, I met this guy from Shelley, Idaho, and he was playing wheelchair basketball. So when I went to college, he invited me to come out and I went to BYU in Provo, Utah. And there was a team. At that time, the Utah Rim Riders was the only team in all of Utah. And they practiced in Salt Lake City. And so I started going to meet with these guys who played basketball. Remember, I had big fat black beach cruiser tires on my wheelchair. And I went in there the first day at the gym and everybody laughed at me. And remember also that in the 1970s, this is 1977, I had a Everest and Jennings chrome folding, old person looking wheelchair. Not that everybody else had sports chairs. Back then, the alternate chair most people were using was called a stainless super sport is what it was called. Anyway, so I was pretty embarrassed when I got in the gym, but I was a pretty small kid and I really wasn't there to play basketball so much as to learn. And so for the next few years, I learned. I changed my chair. I got faster. I learned all the skills and stuff with that sport. But along the way, I also met a guy who was preparing for the Boston Marathon in 1978 and 9. He raced there. And he was a wheelchair user. He had bilateral leg amputations. And so he was mobile and he was fast. And he taught me about wheelchair road racing. That was really exciting to me because I thought I was more of an endurance athlete than I was a basketball skills type athlete. So I started hanging out with him and learning how to, go distance. And so those were the two sports I learned about. Somebody else told me about track and field. And so I dabbled in some shorter races, like on the track. And I was introduced to wheelchair tennis, and I wasn't, interested in that. And I was introduced into shot put, javelin, discus, and I wasn't really interested in any of that. So truly the first sport I got good at was archery, which most people don't even think of as, a disability sport. But in terms of using my wheelchair, two things I learned first were basketball and road racing. And so I kind of just had to grow up. You got to remember, at this time I was like 17 years old, and I was still pretty scrawny. I was under 100 pounds. And so I was quick, I was fast. I went to Denver when I was 18, and I won the slalom competition. If you remember what that is, it's just an obstacle course. And so I wasn't any good with, shooting sports or racket sports, but I was quick and I was good in my wheelchair. And so I won a gold medal in the slalom for class 2 or 3, whatever it was. And I was really proud of that because I thought, wheelchair speed was something that's kind of important to me. So that's kind of where I got started. That's how it all began.
So you found out about a lot of these opportunities through like other friends and things like
Yes.
that kind of like how you would say you kind of got first, one friend was like, oh, play basketball and then do this. And then you
Exactly.
did a cross country biking trip as well, right?
Yeah. So in the early 80s, I got introduced to cycling somebody gave me an old bike model called a Centurion, and it was really bad. It was hand pedaled, but it was really tall. It was like somebody took one of those bikes that you see at a retirement community, and they just kind of adapted it for hand use. And it was so bad that I used it in graduate school once in a while in the 84, 85. And then when I moved away from Portland, Oregon, where I went to graduate school, I just left it there. I basically gave it to a thrift store because it was so bad, I didn't even see a reason to move it. That's how most of the hand cycles were in the 80s. But along about 1991 or so, a company in Oregon that used to make those beach bikes that are reclined, that you pedal with your feet, they built the first modern hand cycle that was really low, and it tilted in the front to lean into your corners. And that started the modern sort of hand cycle. And as soon as I saw one of those, I wanted one, and I got one in 1994. And man, I took to it. I loved bikes as a kid, and that became my favorite sport of all time, which I did. I went on a cross country tour in 1998. But before I got, I got it in 94, had to work up to that. So I participated in a lot of tours out here in the Western United States. There's quite a few of these big bicycle tours, and I got better at going, distances and all that. And along the way, the United States sports teams didn't include hand cycling in 92, 93, 94, but in 90, I think it was 97, they announced that they were going to do the first national championships. And then in 98, they did the first world championships. And so I went to the nationals and world championships in 1998 and 1999. And we were all thinking like me, I was planning to be on the Paralympic team in 2000 that was going to go to Sydney, Australia. I was really excited about that. And the problem was they sent out a letter that said, you are on the US team. They gave us jerseys and, equipment, all this stuff. And then they later announced that the IPC, the International Paralympic Committee, had determined that hand cycling was kind of a new sport. And they had these rules about it had to be popular on 3 continents, and there had to be like 12 countries willing to send a team. And it turned out that we only had like 8 countries willing to send an actual Paralympic team of hand cycle competitors. And so kind of late summer of 1999, they announced, it was in August, they announced they weren't going to introduce hand cycling as a new a demonstration medal sport in 2000. And they pushed it off until 2004 in Athens, Greece. And when they did that, I basically decided I wasn't going to try to stay ready for 4 more years. I was already 40 years old. And it was, the writing was on the wall. My elbow had already been operated on. And, I wasn't going to stay ready for 4 more years. So my opportunity to be a Paralympic athlete in hand cycling, which was my preferred and best sport, dried up, it evaporated. So I was pretty sad about that. But I did go to the World Championships, which were held in the United States in '98 at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And in 1999, they held the World Championships in a small town in France called Blois. And I got to go to that championship too. And I ended up getting a medal in 3 of the 4 events that I was in. So, I felt like it was my chance to show how good I was on the world stage, quote unquote.
That's really, really cool. I'm really sad that you didn't get to do your sport in the Paralympics, I guess, like your main sport. But
then that's when the United States ski coach came to me and said, you've been hanging around our training camps. Why don't you take this seriously and now get cycling out of your brain and focus on skiing? And then, so I did. And I got to go to the Paralympics in Salt Lake in 2002.
That's really awesome. And it's really cool to hear how your story kind of evolves as things are just becoming more accessible in general, that in general, 1974, there are less opportunities, there are less equipment even. And then as you find more things, you're able to do more. It's really cool.
Yeah. So one thing that really helped me in the 70s when I lived so far away from anything was there was a magazine called Sports and Spokes. And I got an early subscription to that, and I would turn the pages and just look at all these people doing things. And it really opened up my mind and my eyes. Even though I wasn't necessarily interested in doing all those sports, it just really showed me what equipment they were using, showed me there were teams, there were schools. I learned that there were schools like University of Illinois that had a national basketball championship for, NCAA type stuff. And it told me who the other teams were in the United States that were competing for the NWBA championships, and it told where all the track meets were. It really kept me in touch. Today, we have obviously the internet that makes everybody feel that connection. But to me, that magazine, when it came out every other month, it was like, man, I would just look at those pages and dream.
That's really, really cool. And really awesome that now there's more options available for everyone to be able to find these.
While you were getting more into adaptive sports, how did you transition from the recreational participation to more competitive participation? I guess you kind of already answered that, but is there any more to that?
I won't mention basketball because I was always on just this team that was in my area. And I was never I knew I wasn't competitive. I was just a good member of a solid team. And we were always ranked in the top 15 or sometimes as high as number 8 in the country. We never got to the Final Four when I was playing for my team, but I played for many, many years. I mean, I'm talking about 16, something like that, years I played basketball. But in terms of cycling, I really started out cycling with just the love of riding in local events and family stuff. That's what I used my bike for. So the switch came to me when I felt like I was really good because I could, for example, if we back up, when I was road racing, I moved from, 6 minutes a mile to 5 minutes a mile. And then I got down to where I could go 4.5 minutes a mile, almost steady. And I got to where I could beat all of the running foot people. And then in 1984, I got good enough where I could beat all of the people that I knew in Utah, every athlete. I'd beat every single one of them at every single race. And I went looking for them, to see if I was that good. And so at the end of 1984, I went all the way to Phoenix, Arizona to race. I got to go find some faster people and see if I'm any good. Yeah. And it's that idea, I think I'm good, but I see these other times by these guys, Rafael Ibarra, he's really fast. I want to race him. So, it's that idea of, I want to see if I'm good at the local level or regional level, that kind of thing. And of course, everybody likes just going to a neighborhood 10K because it's really fun. And even if nobody else shows up to race, it's the feel of it, being on the start line with all those people. So that's what you're saying about switching over to competitiveness where, all right, that's not enough anymore. And for me, this really came for cycling. I got to the point where I could go on these tours like the Seattle to Portland bike ride. It's 100 miles, 2 days in a row. And then the one in Missoula, Montana called the Tour of the Swan River Valley. It's also 100 miles, 2 days in a row, but it's in the 200 miles now, you have a bunch of mountains to go over. So it was way harder than the one in Portland to Seattle. And when I started riding against some of these other guys that were on those tours, even if there was only 3 of them, I realized, man, I could go to the finish and come back and ride in with them because it's still looking for more, and they were all
Yeah.
like dying. My friend Greg couldn't get in my truck at the end. He's like, oh, I couldn't move, and I'm like, let's go. So I realized I was good, but it's that same idea of like, are you really good, or are you just, good because you've only got these people to measure against? So the switch kind of clicked for me that I was good at long distance touring, but that doesn't mean you're fast.
Sure.
And there's a big difference between, bike races. So the short ones are maybe like 8 or 10 miles, and the long ones are more like 25 or 30. And so I had been focused on going in century rides, like these ones that are 100 miles. And I had done quite a few of them. And then I did those two where it's a century ride 2 days in a row after you sleep in a tent, you get up all stiff and cranky. And so I just had this feeling like, I'm really good at going long distance. I want to know if I'm good at going fast.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to some training camps and I loved it. I mean, I thrived on it. I loved being at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs and looking around like, I belong here because I'm an athlete,
Yeah.
It's so cool to be there and to be inspired by like, these are the best in the country. And we would go out on these activities where they weren't teaching us how to pedal and pass and draft people. And then we were doing these hill climb tryouts, and man, I just ate it all up. So one time is all it took for me to sort of measure myself against these other people. Man, I was hooked.
You seem like a very motivated person. And I kind of think of challenge zones here where you kept setting the bar higher and higher with the challenge that you were striving to meet, and then finding that you could meet it, just kept going with it.
Yeah. So here's the funny thing. In 98, I got done with the Ride Across America August 1st. The championships in 98, the world championships, were at Colorado Springs on August 15th, I think. So 2 weeks later, after I just got done riding across the country, I was racing in Colorado Springs. Don't be thinking going 80 or 100 miles a day. You got to go as fast as you can. It's like, whoa, change gears.
Yeah, really.
Really, really weird to switch gears to speed thinking.
From a marathon to a sprint.
Yeah. But if you go back my wife thinks I'm a really unusual person. And here's an illustration. She tells people like I'm weird. So we had a day off from the big ride. We got a day off every 7 days. And we had a day off in Madison, Wisconsin. And everybody likes to go sleep in because they don't have to get up and ride. And there's air conditioning. So you're in a tent, not in a tent, and you're in a bed, and there's no mosquitoes and all of that. And so on that day off, I rented a car in Madison, Wisconsin, and drove to the national championships in Duluth, Minnesota.
Wow.
Raced in a race, got back in the car, got back to my dormitory at the University of Madison at about 2:30 in the morning, but put my bike back together because it had to fit in the car. And I got on the big ride again at 8 o'clock in the morning and rode off. And so I was touring, and then I had to switch to racing, and then back to touring. And I did that all by myself. I didn't have anybody to help me. I was a million miles from anywhere. And I just couldn't stand the idea that they were having a national championship. And I'm like, hey, I'm telling myself, I'm one of the best riders in America. I'm riding across country. When will I be ever more ready to race than right now? So, I mean, I was so deep into cycling, I could barely, focus on anything else that year. It was pretty amazing.
So while you were getting more into the competitive side of sports, did you have any coaches or mentors? Or is this all just like sheer will by yourself to just like keep moving higher and higher?
I've never had a coach.
No.
Of any kind, no. I had mentors that just inspired me to be good because they were really good at what they do. The people who won medals at the Paralympics, two of those were from Utah, Mike Johnson and Kurt Brinkman. They both won medals in 1976 at the games in Montreal, Canada. And I wanted to be like them, no doubt about that, but I didn't ever have a coach. So I joined a cycling club in 97 or 8 because I wanted to be with them when they were doing their workouts, and they would do interval training, and they would have a lot like you see on a Peloton commercial. They'd have a coach there, and the coach would be saying, all right, we're going to go hard for 3 minutes. And they would, watch people's heart rates and all that stuff. And I did that, but that's not really a coach. It's more or less a group thing. So I never had an individual coach to help me out.
With these camps that you would go to, did you find out about them from the magazines or from other people at this point? telling you like, oh, like they're doing this like sport camp or they're doing this?
By the time 97, 98 came out, I don't remember if I heard about it first from a magazine or a website. I can't remember back that far.
Okay, but it was your own research, not other people being like, oh yeah, come do this thing.
Yes.
As a competitor, do you feel like there were challenges, and what, if any, challenges did you face that you think are unique to adaptive athletes that other athletes maybe not face?
Well, as an adaptive athlete, you have big equipment needs. And surprisingly, it's hard to manage the equipment. I mean, harder than most people think. Let me give you 2 examples. Like most hand cycles are longer than 6 feet, and they won't fit in very many cars, like in the car, even station wagons. They won't fit long ways. They're just too dang long. And so a lot of people end up making a bumper carrier of some kind. And so you've got to load your bike onto this bumper carrier kind of thing. And so that's big and awkward. And then, of course, when you get on the bike, now you have to leave your wheelchair somewhere behind. And so you can't just pick it up and shove it in a car door. So you've got to like put it on the bumper carrier and just trust people will leave it alone. Or, you know, it's hard to just leave it sitting in the parking lot, but you can't unload your bike without being in your chair. And so there's this big equipment issue. And then whether you're on a hand cycle or if you're on a racing wheelchair, you go to the start line, but there's this 6-foot long thing won't fit in a bathroom. So now you have to think, okay, am I going to use a bathroom anywhere during this thing that I'm doing or before it, or how much am I going to hydrate? Because that means how much I'm going to have to urinate. So, you know, managing bathroom access and managing your wheelchair and managing your equipment that you're going to race in, that's really hard. And if you are a person, you know, I had a lower injury, so I could do all that myself. But what if you're a person who's a racer who's maybe got a C7 injury and you can't just do all that by yourself? You have to have people to help you. And that's a big thing. Another example is skiing. So cross-country skiing, you get out of your vehicle, but there's no ice. You can't just get out of your car onto your ski. So you got to put your ski on your lap and carry it across the pavement. You can't push it like you can a bike because you don't want the skis to be rubbing on the concrete. So then you have to put your ski down on the slippery ice and then transfer into it with nothing holding it still, just you, unless you have a helper there to hold the ski still. And now that you've pulled your ski over to where there's ice or snow, now you're getting into it. But now what do you do with your wheelchair? Because you're now outdoors. You can't transfer in the lodge and then drive out and leave your chair in the lodge. So you're leaving it sitting in a parking lot or at a trailhead because there's nothing else to do. And I did all my stuff alone. I mean, I did all this stuff. I left my wheelchair up, parked all kinds of places. So maybe I was just used to it, because whenever I got in my canoe and went out fishing, I'd leave it on the boat dock, right? I just, sometimes my son would push it off the dock over to the dirt. So it wasn't like gonna fall in the water. But I mean, I've left it parked all kinds of places. And it's like, well, I don't have much choice, so off we go. So those are things that people don't even think about. The equipment is so big and it's so clunky. And when you switch from one to the other, even people, remember, who push wheelchair basketball wheelchairs into the rec center, they still have to transfer from their basketball chair to their, from their regular everyday chair to their basketball chair. And their basketball chair won't usually fit in a bathroom. And so in the old days, we used to only have one chair. And we would play basketball in it, but we couldn't move the wheels out to a lot of camber, because then you wouldn't be able to use a bathroom. You wouldn't be able to get in the hotel room. You wouldn't be able to do anything. So you had to choose one or the other kind of. Nowadays, people take 2 chairs, but it was not, nobody did that in the late 70s, early 80s. You just had one chair that you took. So that was pushing a basketball wheelchair through an airport. It's just, there's so much. If you want to use the restroom, you got to leave it in the hallway and go in the restroom. Our equipment is just huge. These long, big, wide things, it just makes it a real nuisance. And if you don't have anyone to help you, man, it puts a lot of responsibility and planning on you. The year I went to the National Wheelchair Games in '85 in Tennessee, like I had to sit in my own chair with my wheelchair on my lap and a bag with racing wheels over my shoulder and go all the way down to the gate. And we didn't have these hard shell cases that you could put your chair in and then just push them because they had wheels. So they were sitting on your lap. It was just a lot of logistics involved with it.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, and you're right. I that's not even something, even with the athletes that we were working with, we didn't think about this. I didn't think about this because we would bring all of the equipment to the events that we were training with. So I didn't even think about
if you're managing it yourself, it's a big deal.
Yeah. It's a lot.
I think the restroom piece is something that I wouldn't have thought of that would be like really important for working with adaptive athletes, allowing them to, use the bathroom as they're doing their sport. And like coming up
So
with a
for
plan
example,
to do that.
When I was on that big ride across America, they had bathrooms at every pit stop, about every 20 miles roughly. But none of them were big enough to fit my hand cycle into, certainly.
Sure.
That'd be a huge thing. Even an ADA size stall would not fit. So I would park next to a small one, open the door, transfer my rear into the floor of the bathroom seat. And then I would transfer up onto the commode seat and I would push my bike just far enough that the door would close. And then I would use the bathroom, which is really, really hard because you're sitting on your bike shorts. You have to lift yourself up and pull them down at the same time you're sitting on them. It's really hard in a little porta potty. Then pull them back up and then get back onto the floor, then open the door with your hands and get back on the bike. It's not easy. A lot of people would not be able to do it.
Yeah, that's like a whole other level of
equipment and access are just two really big issues.
Yeah.
So you participated in sports competitions that are designed for just adaptive athletes, but also some that are all ability inclusive. Can you kind of talk about the pros and cons of both? Do you have a preference?
It will depend on the purpose I'm after. And so I love going to community events that are inclusive, where I expect to see friends, neighbors, and my family, my wife, and all of those people, and recreate together and at the finish line, talk about how much fun we had. And it's not anything about competition at all. It's a social activity. And I love those. I went to some events, like in Utah, there was a Brain Injury Association event, and there was an Independent Living Center event. And, I would go to them like 5, 6, 7 years in a row because I just loved being with the people that would show up at those particular events. And other times I would show up for events where I, like the one in Montana, I just wanted to see the scenery. My wife, no one, I didn't know anyone, just my one friend, Greg. So we wanted to see the scenery and ride through the mountains. And then the third one is actually disability focused. And that's when the purpose wasn't to meet people, and it wasn't to see scenery, and it wasn't to socialize. It was to measure yourself, to see how good you are at something. And I always enjoyed the integrated activities, and most races by the late 80s had a wheelchair division, so that they didn't just say, oh, we didn't think anybody in a wheelchair would show up, so we don't have a trophy or any prize money or anything. That was common in the early 80s, but by the late 80s, it was really common for them to be very inclusive and to be very friendly, welcoming, and all of that. So it was really fun to go to those things, just to be with the athletes of your community. It feels really good to just say, I'm one of these people. And other times it was just all about getting my kids to see if they could if they would be interested in any of this competition. And none of them were, but that was okay, because we just used it for fun rides. I mean, we'd go on a neighborhood ride on Sunday afternoon and just see all our neighbors, So that was a real easy thing to do on a bike for me, instead of being in a wheelchair, to go around a little neighborhood community thing. So I guess there's 4 different reasons there. Kind of when the reason matches the opportunity, it feels really good. And when they're crisscrossed, it doesn't feel good. If you go to someplace and the purpose is changed all of a sudden, it takes all the fun out of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you're wanting to just do it for recreation and it becomes a competition, it's no fun, and vice versa. If you're trying to actually measure yourself, compare yourself to everyone, and it's just a like, oh yeah, we forgot about you or we didn't think about you. Yeah, takes away the fun.
I'll give you one little example of that. When I started getting really fast in 1984, I was at the finish line before they even had it open. Like nobody's supposed to be here yet, and they didn't have the timers. Nobody.
Oh man.
There were people in the way. There were at the event called the Salt Lake City the Memorial Day Classic. It finished in downtown, and it finished on the parade route. No, that was the Desert News 10K. And so they didn't have the parade route closed. And so I went to the finish area, and there were just people standing all through the course. And I was going fast. And I actually, one time I hit a kid, and I felt terrible because he fell over me, because wheelchairs are low. And I hit his leg just wrong. And he fell and rolled on my back and fell behind me. And I just kept going. But so when they're not prepared for what they're getting, racing wheelchairs are faster than all the runners. And it's just no good when it's I'm competing and they're just thinking, oh, nobody will be here for another 20 minutes,
Yeah, that's a good point. So how did your training change? So we kind of talked about this a little too, but more specifically, how did you change your training when you were like, all right, I'm going to be highly competitive, going on tours or for the Paralympics? For the Paralympics, did you have to move to Denver or travel there multiple times? How did you train for the skiing?
For ski training, I did things in my basement, like the ski team coach gave us a routine to use a medicine ball, not the soft kind, the rubber medicine ball that bounces. So I had a place in my basement where there was a concrete floor, and you take the ball and you hold it in your hands and you throw it down as hard as you can, because that's a downward force, like you're going to be skiing. And it hits the floor, it bounces against the wall, and you catch it up here again. And you throw it down and kadoom, catch, kadoom, catch, kadoom, catch it. And you do a lot of indoor training. But no, I never moved anywhere else, because Salt Lake City, where I lived in Alpine, Utah at the time, and there's enough courses where you can ski, not all year round, but after Thanksgiving, there's enough courses where you can ski all the way through March. So I did indoor training and then ski training for skiing. And with bicycling, I got an indoor bike ergometer where you park your bike on the spinner. And I did a lot of training on the bike in my house all through the winter, obviously, and then more training outdoors in the summer. And I used things like a heart rate monitor, and I used a time trial course, and I used a miles per hour average, and I used a lot of self-coaching things to measure if I was getting stronger or faster or better. And of course I said I went to that group thing with some interval training. And so my training just got more year round when I was doing both of those sports. And then it got more quantifiable, meaning I tracked things. I wrote down speeds. I wrote down on my ergometer, it tracks watts. And I always tried to improve my watts of output power on my bike. And so I used numbers as my coach and my guide to make myself do better. And I have this all in a training log, which I still have today. I wrote down how long I went and all this stuff, so that I would say next year, am I stronger than last year? And at the end of this 2-month period, am I stronger than before? And so I did most of my own coaching just by numbers, running numbers.
That's kind of amazing to me that you just had such a self-directed training routine. Did you have any resources as far as like training plans went, or was it just all by constantly improving and keeping the metrics and trying to improve them?
Really, it was just by riding familiar courses and familiar events. And like on my ergometer, I have a 10-mile time trial, and I would do that. And so really, it was mostly just comparisons of my own performance against.
There were no like books that you read or any training plans that you got.
So once when I was at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, they put me on one of those VO2 max machines. And I never had access to one where I could compare. I only ever had 2 of those in my whole career, opportunities to be on one. And they both told me, wow, I was really good. And so that was just a boost to say you're good. But I never measured my number. I'm not sure I ever wrote them down to compare to any other endurance athlete. It was just a moment for me to say, I'm good. It was like, get a boy, go get him. Your training is working kind of thing. But no, I never read any books about any specific style or For example, when I was bike racing, I never did weightlifting. And
Mhm.
I didn't think that bike racers lifted weights. Maybe I was wrong, but I never did it because I didn't think they did. I would watch the, Tour de France and stuff, and I never thought those guys lifted weights. And so I just rode my bike as my, like I rode to ride. I didn't ever do any lifting to supplement my strength. I rode lots of hills. I mean, lots of hills. Canyons. Utah has lots of canyons, and I went up every canyon there ever was. So anyway, I probably wasn't doing it right, but I was all I knew. So that's what I did.
It's an interesting perspective because we said we had interviewed a adaptive coach prior to interviewing you. And her thing was, you got to get a coach, you got to have a training plan, which I'm sure is a good way to go about doing it. But you didn't really have any of that in your experience. And so,
I'm not saying I was against a coach. I just didn't know how
yeah,
to get a coach or where to get a coach or
Right.
what a coach could offer me or how could you pay for a coach, or it was just
yeah.
like the unobtainable. So I just did what I could do to do without.
Cool that you were able to be so successful doing just continually finding the next challenge. That's really cool. Very a cool thing about
The
you. I
numbers
think.
key.
Just find the next thing that you can do. That's really cool.
Hey everybody! I just wanted to take a quick break to remind you all that all of our research guides as well as our show notes can be found on our website, www.realtalkrecreationtherapy.com. If you're looking for those resources, go check it out. Okay, now back to the podcast episode.
I guess going back to the recreation side, what do you think recreation directors or recreation therapists or people working in like all-inclusive recreation can do to make their activities more inclusive?
Well, in the 1970s, first of all, we would go to play basketball at these gyms where there was no accessible bathrooms. So people were going outside and going to the bathroom in the bushes and stuff. I mean, we've outlived that part, 1975, 6, 7, and all that stuff. But when I went to a tournament in Salt Lake City, there were 6 teams or something there, and they only had, at the time, this one rec center, they only had 2 accessible bathroom stalls. And you've got 80 or something guys, and they all come out after a game or at halftime or something, and there's more than 2 people that want to use a bathroom. And rotating through there, it was a terrible thing. And you go to most of these events where it's a road race, there's several hundred people there. They got one accessible bathroom, an ADA sized bathroom, but everybody uses it. So then, just first of all, being able to use a bathroom is a big deal. That makes it more friendly. If you have a place to take care of your changing your clothes and take care of your bathroom needs, that's the first thing that I ran up against in the long time ago, is at an indoor basketball or outdoor event like a 10K. Those were issues. Making it more friendly, the next thing I faced is, as I said, I didn't have a wheelchair that was suitable to play basketball in. And so in the 1970s, the late 70s, Easter Seals of Utah purchased some sports wheelchairs, and they made it so that you could borrow one. And that allowed me to try a good chair. My parents didn't want me playing sports in my chair because they thought it would break, and then at the time you were thinking, well, insurance won't buy you a new one because they just bought you one last year. So they would have to pay for it. And so I used a borrowed chair for a long time. Eventually I bought one that was used. And eventually after that, I made one myself. I learned how to weld, and I just created my own basketball wheelchair. So most people aren't going to go down that path, but having sports chairs to try, is my point, is a really big deal. And I think everybody deserves the right to try to see what a good piece of equipment can do for them before they have to launch in and just buy one, because they could try one of a certain brand or make and say they like it or not, and then buy one based on those, reviews. And so trying it out is an important thing. Then the last thing is the attitude. It's one thing to have accessible facilities, but if you don't have the right attitude where you're welcome to play, you're welcome there, and you're not seen as a pain in everyone's side, that there's events, programming events, that feels like you're included in the events of that place. There's a big difference between feeling welcome architecturally versus feeling welcome programmatically and attitude-wise. So I think those are the things that community sports, have to offer I was told that there was no junior jazz wheelchair basketball program until one mom called up and said, my son uses a wheelchair and he wants to play. And they said, well, do you think there's enough people to form a team? And she said, well, heck yes, there are. Like, are you crazy?
Yeah.
So she got the mailing list together and she invited them all to come out and play. And then there was a junior jazz wheelchair basketball team, but it was not the rec center that said we should have a team. It was a mom. So I think the rec centers have a responsibility to say, could we have a goalball team, or could we have a wheelchair basketball team, or could we have a wheelchair rugby team? I think it's their responsibility to find out, and not some mom's responsibility to call up and ask. Of course, there's nothing wrong with moms asking.
No.
But it should be like, we're here to program and we offer something. So let's put the word out and take a pulse of our people. Do you want to play this or that? And anyway, so I think they should reach out more.
I think that that's like a common misconception that they might feel is, well, there's only like 3 people that use a wheelchair in this city, so there isn't enough for a team, yeah, I think that that's probably a common misconception among them.
And then on their website or in their communications, they could say things like, we have a team and here's what they did last year and here's our plans for this year. And that's really a marketing tool. But, starting at the first time, it's a little harder. But from then on, you should be proud of them and like put the word out, like, this is stuff we do. Tell people, not in secret. Here's all of our running adaptive, running sports, like, soccer. And then there's a little link that says for adaptive sports, click here. There should be something on the banner, we offer sports for everybody. If you use a wheelchair or run or whatever, like, we got some for you, instead of like an afterthought.
Yeah. If the opportunity exists, people will come and join it.
Not only that, but if somebody sees a wheelchair basketball team there and they have a higher injury, they don't see a picture of quad rugby, then they'll say, well, if they got a basketball team, well, then they have to have a rugby team. So it's like one thing feeds to the next if you think that if they have both.
Yeah, that's great. What is your proudest, most favorite moment, competitive athlete? What is your favorite?
Well, this is going to sound sappy, but in 1999, my dad got diagnosed with cancer. And my brother's a fine arts major, and he always wanted to go to Europe. And when my dad and my brother found out that I was going to be racing with the US cycling team in France, they scheduled a trip to Europe to see all the, art of Europe and all the architecture. And they scheduled to be in Blois, France, the same day I was going to be racing. And so for them to be there at my race and for me to win 3rd place in the, second place in the time trial, and to be up on the podium in France in 99, Lance Armstrong was winning the Tour de France for the very first time at that time. And cycling was this big thing. And France was alive with excitement about cycling in general. And to be wearing the stars and stripes and have them give me a medal in saying you're one of the best in the world, and have my dad and my brother there because nobody else could afford to go, to have them there and to see me cross the finish line, that was a really, really big experience, high on my list, because my father passed away about 6 months later. And so it was really cool that he got to be there for this. He was, you got to remember, he carried me all over the place when I was 75 pounds and I was this broken little boy who he thought would never accomplish anything, and here I was racing on the USA team against the world, and this little kid from Idaho made good, it's like, it was a big moment. Yeah. So that was a really big thing. But also he was there, and my wife and children were there in Washington, D.C. when we came riding in on the big ride and having crossed the whole United States. And, I was just crying tears and tears and tears because I didn't think I could do it. Now in the race, I knew I could race that distance. I just didn't know I would be a place winner, right? I'd make the podium. But I really didn't know if I could actually ride all the way across America, 80 miles every single day. Like, I didn't know if I could make it. And so to actually make it and not go home, not quit, that was a really big thing for a different reason, but they were all there to celebrate that win with me as well. And I guess in terms of skiing, when I skied into the stadium and waved at my family, they were all up there with the cowbells ringing and going around that stadium loop for the biathlon, for example. You ski through the stadium 3 times, you go once and shoot, twice and then shoot, and then you go through the third time to the finish line. And so each time I came through there, it was like this huge number of people just cheering. And to have that validation when I was a little boy, age 15 or 16, and I met Kurt Brinkman, and I said, I want to be like that guy. I want to be on the Paralympic team. Well, 26 years later, I was on the Paralympic team, and I was skiing through the stadium, and they were all cheering for me, you know? So those were really big moments, really big moments for me, because it was like, the bottom line, what made it such a big moment was like, my life wins. Disability doesn't win. Like, my choices chose my life path. I didn't say I have to do this because I use a wheelchair. I didn't say I can't do that because I use a wheelchair. I said, this is what I want to do. And my life choices came true, instead of saying, oh, he's that kid who couldn't do stuff because of his disability. It was like a validation of like, you can do your dreams.
Yeah, that's really beautiful and inspiring to just take control and you define who you are. And those are really cool defining moments, I think, for anybody.
So I feel like you answered a lot of the questions that we had already. I think probably the next question I would ask for you is, what advice do you have for young adaptive athletes or people that maybe want to become an adaptive athlete? They're not quite there yet.
Well, my biggest advice is that you should try a lot of different sports until you find the one that really is this sort of passionate inside of you type of a sport. But once you find that one sport, it doesn't mean you should quit doing everything else. Like, I played tennis for, 10 years, just because I loved being around those friends of mine who never were going to ride a bike and weren't ever going to be in a 10K. But I really needed their association. So I was getting a lot from playing tennis, even though I wasn't any good at playing tennis. Associating with the right people is critical, I think, to support someone in the long-term, lifelong coping and dealing with disability issues. You need to have other people that are just people. But where do you meet those guys? Well, if I only ever stuck with one sport, I'd only have a little peer support group of maybe, 5 people. But by branching out, by allowing yourself to go participate in a sport, you're never going to win, but you're not there to win. I think that's a really critical piece of information I would give to people. Find your passion, but then don't eliminate everything else and just focus in on one thing only at the expense of everything else. And then also, I would say, make a plan that you can still do really interesting things that are after you're out of the competitive kind of side of things. When I quit skiing in 2002, I had my second surgery on my elbow. I had to find something to do besides race or compete. Like, I had to switch from athletic thinking to life thinking. And so, I think everybody should sort of put some things in their mind that can be really gratifying things to do in life for when sports competition starts to tell you you're done, and your body says that you need a new thing that's not quite so intense. So that's another piece of advice I would give to people. But the bottom line, I guess, is what are you trying to get from it? I started all my sports just looking for ways to be my best. And I only competed after I, wanted to see how good I had become. And I think some people are more extrinsic, and they want to win a medal, or they want to be recognized for something, and they want to have external validation. And when I was a small town kid in small town races, you don't get any of that. What you get is an internal measure of how you're doing. So I think people who are really good athletes are people who are racing an internal standard, and the external validation feels good once in a while, but that's not why they do it. It's got to be this internal thing. There's a quote that I'm going to mess up. A really famous race car driver who was injured in a Formula One race accident. I showed you this video probably in class, Jana. And he became a hand cycler because he lost both of his legs. He went back to car racing, but he loved hand cycling, and he won some medals in hand cycling in both London and in Rio. And he said, I didn't win a gold medal because I was setting out to win a gold medal. He said, I won a gold medal because I love to ride my bike. I messed that up. If you look it up, you'll find it. But essentially, he was saying, I loved riding my bike. It's coincidental that I won a medal at doing it. I never set out to win a medal. That's what I'm trying to say. Set out to be your own best self at the things you choose to do. And sometimes you'll get external validation for it, and sometimes you won't, but it doesn't matter because it was in you anyway.
I can see that being really good advice that a recreational therapist could give to someone that they're working with who's kind of like trying to find their motivation for participating in recreation or sport. It's like finding those internal motivators.
Yeah, you should be an intrinsically driven person, and everything else good will happen if you are. We've all known stories of people who, their parents pushed them to do a sport or some talent or whatever. And the minute their parents weren't watching or pushing, they kind of just faded away. So don't just be doing these things because you saw somebody else do it. When I met Kurt and Mike and tried some things here and there, I didn't try to invent myself as them. I just tried to invent okay, dream bigger, whatever your dream is.
So you mentioned the Easter Seals in Utah. What does that organization do, specifically?
Well, in the olden days, they used to be formed in order to combat childhood birth defects. And how they got involved in wheelchair sports, I'm not sure, because I came on the scene after all that had already happened. I knew one of the directors, and maybe she did fundraising to buy those chairs, but Easter Seals had a good name and a reputation for using funds to help kids who were born with birth defects. And so it was for kids with spina bifida and other things like that. But I was a 14-year-old who needed a sport wheelchair, and so they were willing to allow me to use one. Easter Seals still exists, but I don't know what their mission, if their mission has changed or what they really do now. I think that they, obviously we don't go talking about birth defects, and we don't go advertising that we need to raise money to solve problems of birth defects. So their mission probably has changed, and they probably go about it in a different way. They probably kind of lay low in terms of not using that language. But I know they still exist. I can't tell you really what they do.
I think it depends on the state that they're in, because some of them have adaptive camps and some of them are more of like a organization that has community events or.
Yeah, that sounds right. They used to do the walkathon in my neighborhood, and that's the first thing I ever tried to push a long distance in my wheelchair was the walkathon.
Are there any other organizations that you want to promote or let people know to find adaptive equipment or?
Yeah, so whenever people ask about it, I mention two things. And one is Blaze Sports, which is a series of camps that they do to find people and help them get involved in adaptive sport. And I've never been to one. I just have seen about them, read about them, heard about them all my life, Blaze Sports. And then the other one that I do have familiarity with is if you need equipment, sometimes I'll encourage people to write a grant to the Challenged Athletes Foundation, the CAF. And they're very good at helping people get started and trying, new equipment and getting moving in a sports direction. Other than that, then everything else is kind of like just places to buy used equipment or, you're more on your own. But those are the two organizations that I tell people to check out when they're interested. I don't know any others really to tell you about.
Yeah, Blaze Sports, for recreational therapists or recreation professionals working in adaptive sports, they actually offer a few different certifications that you can get. So I have the Certified Adaptive Recreation and Sports Specialist Level 1 certification, which crash course in adaptive sport, adaptive recreation, but it's another Perfect. Credential that someone working in the field could possibly pursue if they were looking to gain more knowledge and just credibility.
I hope that people who graduate from my program go right in there and say, oh, this is a perfect match. Like I already know all this.
Yeah. As a rec therapist, when I took the certification, it was pretty self-explanatory just based off of the degree that I have, but it was a good thing.
The only one I've ever heard of where people used is the Christopher Reeve Foundation. They have a thing called Quality of Life Grant. And I've never known anyone who got one, but I know that they offer them. And of course, veterans have a whole different thing. So
yes.
anyway, those are the organizations that I know or have used or could tell you about.
Perfect. Thank you. We will put those up for recreation therapists. If you're looking for these in our show notes, they're at realtalkrecreationtherapy.com. You can find all of those. I think that's is there anything else that you want to share with us about your competitive experiences or any other wisdom you want to impart?
I really loved all of this choices, those sports choices that I made and did. It enhanced my life greatly, both in sport, but also, we all know that it crosses domains and it makes you better at every other facet of life, whether it's, school or jobs or anything, because it shapes your personality. So I loved all of the things I got from that. Sometimes I took it too far and pushed my family sort of into second seat when I was getting ready for an event, and maybe that's not good, but people who want to win on a world stage, you kind of have to do that. And I sometimes, wanted to quit my job and just focus on sports because people that I was competing against didn't have a job and they didn't have to work 40 hours a week. And I sometimes was jealous of those people who had more hours to devote to getting good. And, there were times when it was frustrating, and there was times when it was frustrating for my wife. And so it's not all as, a smooth sailing, like do your best and everyone will love you for it. It's filled with struggle. And when you want to buy a new bike and it's $8,000 and you can't afford it, and, there's struggle all along the way. But in spite of all of that, in spite of all of the impinging I did on my family and all of the budget and all of the travel and all of the telling my boss at work, like, for example, that year in 98, I was only back at work 11 days before I took off again for the next race. He was not happy, Anyway, it was all still worth it to me, even though at the time it was really hard decisions and really frustrating. In retrospect, I don't regret any of those choices. It was all worth it because the value of it lasts way longer than the doing of it. And so the value will affect your whole life for the rest of your life. For example, I've had a shoulder replacement this year, and I've had an elbow surgery this year for the 4th time. And every single time I'm coming back from these life events, I'm still an athlete in training. Like, I'm pushing myself and recovering and becoming independent. And my wife is sometimes telling me, look, you need to stop and slow down. And I'm like, honey, have you met me? I'm like, I don't slow down and stop. I push. I get back to, like my independence. And that attitude carries you through so many of life's problems. So this kind of personality that you develop through all of this, it serves you well in other areas. And it's why I'm who I am. It's why I recover quickly from these big problems. And I back up and face problems and choose different ways to attack. And it all comes from that. It's this way of being that's way beyond athletics. Maybe it was in me before athletics, but athletics brought it out, and I never regretted any of that.
That's really, really great and really awesome to hear. I miss your lectures. Like, I need to go back and take a class or something. This is great. Thank you so much for.
Well, you're very welcome.
Thanks
for the compliment. I'm going to retire next year in December of next year. 1 year from today, I will be retiring.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
What are you going to do in your retirement? More sports?
No, because my shoulder and my elbow just can't do it anymore. So I'm going to be doing things that are gratifying in other ways. Like, I'm going to be doing more motorcycle touring. I have a big Honda Goldwing, and I've been out on 10 different trips on that. And to go on a trip up into British Columbia and ride through the scenic mountain roads on a motorcycle is a pretty good second to handcycling across the country.
Yeah. That's awesome.
A lot less taxing on my physical body.
Well, thank you so much for taking this time to share with us and with everybody else that's listening to hear your experiences and hear how they can help the athletes that they're working with to be able to reach their dreams and develop the skills and abilities that they need to be able to do these things. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for asking me.
All right, everybody. Thanks so much for coming, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Well, as always, thank you again for joining us for this episode of Real Talk Recreation Therapy. We hope that you found lots of helpful information for your practice as recreational therapists. If you're looking for some of the resources that we mentioned, you can go to our website, www.realtalkrecreationtherapy.com. We hope you'll join us for the next episode. Bye!